Alright, so today I'm going to be introducing to you the 5 classical orders. Now, what is an order? An order is basically a style of building or a style of architecture. And is usually used in the classical sense, which refers to the time period in which ancient Greece and the ancient Roman Empire and ancient Roman Republic were thriving. Now, it's usually used for temples, which is seen in this image here. Okay, this portion of the temple is known as the pediment. It's usually seen in a triangle. And although it's not actually part of the order, it's still important to know since they're seen in a lot of them, like in a lot of temples. Alright, the next portion is called the cornice. After that is called the frieze. Now the frieze is important because a lot of sculptures are located on this area, particularly relief sculptures. And this is basically when the sculptures are directly carved into your frieze or into the wall, in this case. Now here, this is called the architrave, and it's located below the frieze. Now, these 3 portions of the structure, the cornice, frieze, and architrave, are collectively known as the entablature. And the entablature varies among the different orders, which we'll look into a little bit later into the video. This portion of your pillar is called the capital. This part of the structure also varies among the different orders. Now, one part to note is this little section right here. It's really small, circling it here. This part is known as the abacus. Now, this provides for it's a slab of stone and provides for structural support for the top or the entablature, so it doesn't just collapse in on itself. Alright, the next portion is called the shaft, which is pretty self-explanatory. After, it's called this base, I should say, of the pillar is known as the plinth. Right? And then this part, which is also not part of the actual order, is called the stylobate. So the actual parts of the order are the actual parts of the structure that are actually included in the order is everything from here all the way down to here. The pediment and the stylobate, neither of those are included in the order, but they're still important to know about. Alright. Now before we move on to the actual orders, I would like to talk about these structures. These are known as caryatids, and that's basically when the pillars are carved in the structure of a woman. These sculptures are actually called chorai, like in general, like if it's a woman, it would be called a chorai sculpture. But in this case, if it's become the pillar, or if it actually is the pillar, then it's called a caryatid. Moving on. Now this structure right here is known as the Parthenon. It's Parthenon, not to be confused with the Pantheon, which is located which was built during the Roman Empire. But the Parthenon was created during ancient Greece. It's located in Athens, Greece. And the pillars used here is a good example of the Doric order. This is the oldest Greek order, and it's also the simplest Greek order, and knowing the difference between Greek and Roman is pretty important. Now, the Doric order has a plain capital, which you can see here. The capital is pretty plain, there's not much to it, so yeah. There's usually no plinth. See, there's like the shaft goes straight into your stylobate here. There's no base, or there's no plinth, which is uncharacteristic of the other orders. Now, so one thing to note is that the thickness is much larger than later orders. It is much thicker, and the Roman architect and engineer, Vitruvius would call this pillar, this order, masculine because of its thicker nature. Okay, now moving on. The frieze. Now, this is pretty important. This part of the frieze is known as a triglyph. Triglyph. I should write frieze. This is known as your triglyph. It's called the triglyph because it has 3 little carvings which are put into it. And these triglyphs are located around the frieze, which is also seen here. You can see there are triglyphs. Now, the spaces between the triglyphs are known as metopes. So this portion is called a metope. Metope. Okay, and metopes usually have relief sculptures carved into them as well, similar to up here. You can see that there is relief sculpture in the frieze. Alright. Now, we can talk about these little lines on the actual pillar. Now, these lines, these are called flutes, or fluting, right? And Doric, the Doric order usually has about 20 flutes. Around 20, which is less than the later orders. Alright. Now, moving on to the next order. This is called the Ionic order, and it comes after the Doric order. This one is more ornate or more decorative than the Doric order. The first thing you probably notice is this capital, which is much more different. It has these little spirals, which are known as volutes. These little thingies here, right? And that's much different than this very simple capital in the Doric order. Now we can talk about how this shaft is much taller than the Doric order, and the flutes, there are 24 of them, which is 4 more than the Doric order. It is also much more slender in size, which led Vitruvius to call this order more feminine. Or feminine, I can't spell. Alright, and now an obvious difference here is that there's actually a plinth this time, which was not seen in the previous order. Alright, one more thing to note is that right here in your capital, you can see that, well, it's hard to see, but there's usually something called an egg and dart motif. And they usually look like little circles like this, and there's like little arrows or something. It kind of looks like that, but these are usually associated with the Ionic order. Alright, moving on. The next order is the Corinthian order. Corinthian order. Now, this one is the most ornate of the 3 Greek orders. Now, the capital, way larger than the previous 2. And you can see that there are these leaves. There's 2 rows of these leaves. These are called acanthus leaves. I've attached an image of an acanthus over here. This is an acanthus leaf. And these leaves were located in the region, which is why they are carved into the actual pillar, or the capital in this case. The shaft is also slender, similar to the Ionic order. And there's also a plinth. There's also 24 flutes, which is the same amount as the Ionic order. Okay, now we can see up here, well, it's actually hard to see once again because of the quality, but there's also smaller volutes up here, the smaller spirals, and that's different than the Ionic order, which you can clearly see was much bigger. Here they are much smaller, which just goes to show how ornate the Corinthian order is. And it's also taller. So the Doric order is usually the shortest. This Doric order is the shortest and thickest. Ionic order is a bit taller and more slender. And then Corinthian order is the tallest. Greek order. Okay, now that we've talked about the Greek orders, there's 3 Greek orders. The 3 Greek orders. We can talk about something called entasis. Entasis. Now, what is entasis? Entasis is basically a mathematical concept that the Greeks implemented into their orders, which is implemented into their shaft. So it's hard to see from this image, but they added a bit of a curvature into the pillar or into the shaft, which adds an effect or decorative effect. This is most clearly seen in the Parthenon. You can see it's a bit curved, and particularly it's curved 2/3 the way up. So it curves like it curves up, then it becomes straighter down. So 2/3 and 1/3 is straight. Now, there's one more thing I need to mention, and that's moldings. Moldings. Now, what is a molding? A molding, you may have noticed that in a lot of these entablatures, you can see that there's like a lot of like protrusions coming out. There's a lot of decorative protrusions. You can see it up here as well. There's like these lines that are added into the architrave. That's called a molding. Moldings are used to transition between elements of the structure. So it makes it more decorative, or makes the orders more decorative. Alright, moving on. This is called the Tuscan order, and this is the beginning of the Roman orders. We have the Tuscan. Right? Here, we can see it's very simple. Actually, in fact, this is the most simplest of all 5 orders, like Greek and Roman. So you can see this capital is basically nothing in it, and it's very simple. Here we can see the abacus. Here we can see, here we can see the shaft. And one thing you notice is, where's the lines? There's no fluting, which is very different. But we can see that there is indeed a plinth. The frieze is also smaller usually. We can't see it from this picture, but it usually has a smaller frieze. Alright, so after the Tuscan order, something called the Composite order. Now, the Composite order is the final order that I will be speaking about, and it's the most recent Roman order. Composite. Now, why is it called Composite? Well, it's basically a combination of the Corinthian and Ionic order. So it really just goes to show how much the Romans admired Greek architecture, or just Greek society and Greek culture in general. Now here we can see the capital is very similar to the Corinthian order. Here we can see the volutes are bigger. Well, in the Corinthian they were much smaller. Here we can see our acanthus leaves. And here we can see, that was bad. Oh my gosh. Here we can see our shaft is also very slender. There's also 24 flutes. Here we can see our plinth is also visible, or also existent, unlike the Doric order. And there's really not much to say about the composite order other than that it was Roman. It was Roman. It was a combination of the Corinthian and Ionic, and that it used larger volutes. And that will conclude the video. To review, we basically went over 5 orders, right? We have the 3 Greek orders, which are Doric, Ionic, and what's happening here? Corinthian. And for the Roman orders, we have the Tuscan, and we have the Composite order.